Ghent, a city of stone and silence, where the walls remember everything. Not the kind of silence that soothes, but the kind that holds its breath before something breaks. On one cold morning in the 14th century, something did. A man was dragged into the city square, wrists bound, shoulders bare, eyes wide not with terror but disbelief. He had spoken for the city, led it, smiled in its councils, and now it wanted to peel the skin from his flesh. They didn't use fire, no gallows, just a post, a knife, and the hands of justice guided not by kings, but by neighbors. His name was Balthasar. He had once stood in the heart of Ghent as its voice. Now he was the vessel for its rage. His skin came off in pieces. Each strip fell like a confession, torn straight from the bones of betrayal. The crowd didn't scream, they watched, quiet, focused, as if flaying was not cruelty but clarity. There were no royal decrees. No trials, no pardons. The Duke had sent gold. Balthasar had bent the knee, and for that he had to be unmade. Ghent was not a kingdom, it had no crown, but it had a memory sharper than steel, and today it would carve that memory into flesh. Balthasar wasn't just being punished, he was being erased, and it didn't begin with a knife. It began with power, the kind that doesn't need a throne to rule. The kind that hides behind a smile, behind closed doors, behind the seal of a deal struck in shadow. Because before the crowd gathered, before the blade touched skin, there was a city on edge, and a man who thought no one saw him kneel. The city had no king, but it knew how to destroy one of its own. Ghent, for all its stone walls and merchant pride, was a city perpetually at war with crowns. It hated outside rule with a bitterness that ran deeper than loyalty. It was ancestral, instinctive, and sharpened over generations of blood-soaked treaties and betrayals. The Dukes of Burgundy had tried again and again to choke it into submission with gold, with force, with noble decrees wrapped in velvet. But Ghent answered not with armies nor speeches, but with silence, sabotage, and sometimes the knife. In this world, loyalty was a blade with no handle, and those who grasped it bled. Balthasar knew this. He had risen through the smoke and iron of the city's inner gears, not by birthright, but by maneuvering. He was not a soldier. He was not a noble. He was worse, a survivor with charm, a man who could sit in two rooms at once and never seem out of place. In the guild halls, he was firm. In the streets, he was friendly. In secret chambers, lit by dying candlelight, he was something else entirely, a man who listened when the Duke whispered. No one saw the exact moment he crossed the line. There were no witnesses to the handshake, the nod, the sealed letter. But something shifted. His words grew slower, his orders quieter. He spoke of compromise, of trade routes, of long-term alliances. Words that smelled too much like obedience. The people of Ghent weren't scholars, but they could read rot. They began watching him, not with accusation, but with patience. They did confront. They waited. And when the news finally came that the Duke's soldiers had passed through a checkpoint without resistance, that a gate had opened without command, no one needed proof. They needed a rope. The city didn't panic. It prepared, doors were barred, alleyways closed. When they came for Balthasar, they didn't come with rage. They came with intention. Cold, calculated, like a merchant balancing books. He didn't run. He couldn't, and maybe deep down, he didn't want to, because men like him, who live by secrets, know that once the mask slips, there is no putting it back on. As they dragged him to the square, he begged no one. His eyes searched the crowd not for mercy, but for someone who still believed in him. There was no one. What came next would not begin with the blade. It would begin with the stripping of illusions. One by one, Ghent would remove every lie he had worn until only the truth remained. The truth and the flesh that covered it. But before the knife, there was the post. And before the post, there was the crowd. And in that crowd were people he knew, men he drank with, children he'd nodded to, women who had once cheered his name. Now they watched him with a silence more brutal than any scream, and still he hadn't yet screamed. Not until they began to tie him down, not until the knife was shown, not until the first incision was drawn along his back like a signature. But we are not there yet. Because to understand what Ghent did to Balthasar, we must first understand what Balthasar did to Ghent. Balthasar didn't betray Ghent in one night. He did it like a craftsman, quiet, methodical, and with steady hands. There was a time when his name stirred respect, a figure molded not by war, but by the slow, grinding politics of guilds and markets. He wasn't born into a crown. He built his own, forged from alliances, flattery, and the illusion of neutrality. That's what made him dangerous. He didn't look like a traitor. He looked like the future. But power, real power, is never quiet for long. The Duke of Burgundy had been watching Ghent for years, watching its disobedience, its arrogance, its refusal to kneel. And like any hunter who tires of chasing, the Duke found a softer path, corruption from within. He didn't need to burn the city. He needed someone to open the gate. Balthasar never said yes. He didn't have to. The deal was older than signatures. It started with letters sealed in wax, passed through merchant hands, phrased with exquisite ambiguity, stability, security, shared interest. Then came the gifts, then the coin, then the promises. Whispers that if he helped facilitate peace, Ghent would thrive. The people would thank him. He would go down in history not as a traitor, but as a stabilizer, a savior, a man who spared his city from war. And maybe, for a time, he believed that. But treason never feels like treason when you're holding the pen. It was in the little things. He delayed a vote. He stalled a militia order. He opened a gate 5 minutes too early, all justified, all explainable. But each step shifted the balance until Ghent was standing on one leg over a pit and Balthasar held the rope. The Duke sent him praise, letters signed with subtle congratulations. He was told he had done well, that his city would be grateful once it understood. But Ghent didn't need to understand. Ghent could smell blood, and Balthasar, he began to change. He smiled less, ate alone, walked with his head down, though he claimed it was humility. He started to imagine shadows behind him, faces in windows, the weight of hundreds of eyes he could no longer meet. At night, he stopped sleeping. The street where he once walked like a prince now narrowed around him like a coffin. No one called him out. No one needed to. He was unraveling from the inside, because deep down, he knew what was coming. He'd seen what Ghent did to those it deemed disloyal. And now, with every heartbeat, his city began to close in on him, not with swords, not with fire, but with silence. And silence in Ghent was always the sound of something about to break. Still, he tried to stand tall. Still, he went to council. Still, he smiled when the crowd passed. But it was all just one long rehearsal for death. And then the gate opened. The Duke's men walked through unchallenged, and the city, watching from its stone windows, knew. Ghent had not been conquered, it had been sold, and they would not let the seller leave with skin intact. The gates of Ghent didn't just open, they gaped like a wound, and the city bled fury. When the Duke's troops stepped through without resistance, no one screamed, no one rioted. That would have been too simple. Ghent had seen betrayal before. But this was different. It wasn't a noble turning coat or a soldier deserting the field. This was betrayal from within, by a man who wore the city's trust like a second skin, and now that skin was forfeit. Word didn't spread, it boiled. No proclamations were needed, no accusations. The people moved like one body, not whipped into chaos, but driven by something colder, older, an instinct to purge. Balthasar felt it. He knew before the first knock, before the first hand grabbed his collar. The moment the Duke's banner passed through the eastern gate, he became a ghost wearing his own face. He didn't run. What would be the point? He belonged to the city now, not as a citizen, but as an offering. They didn't drag him through the streets in chains. They walked him, not like a prisoner, like a procession, a public unveiling. His face pale, his legs weak. His mouth opened more than once, but no words came. What could he possibly say? That it was for peace, that he meant well, that treason is just strategy with better manners. The crowd didn't curse, they didn't spit, they stared. Men, women, even children, watching the man who traded their safety for a seat at someone else's table. There was no ceremony, no gavel, just a city holding its breath and a post waiting in the square. And Balthasar, he still hadn't cried. Somewhere deep inside, a part of him was still bargaining, still hoping for a reprieve. Maybe they'd exile him, maybe they'd just humiliate him, maybe someone would step in. He was, after all, once their voice. But Ghent had no king, and today it had no mercy. At the center of the grand square, the wood post stood ready, not adorned, not ritualized, just a thick trunk soaked with the memory of other punishments. Behind it a table, on it the tools, iron hooks, blades, leather cords, buckets, and folded linen cloths, not for cleaning blood but for catching it. They stripped him in silence. The garments that once marked his office were peeled away without ceremony. He stood bare in the wind and for the first time looked small, not like a villain, not like a leader, just a man soft, trembling, exposed. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't blink, because what they were about to witness wasn't vengeance, it was ritual. Balthasar tried to speak. His lips moved, no sound came, and then they bound him to the post, not with chains but with ropes. Not to restrain but to present, his arms stretched tight, back arched, skin pulled taut, not a prisoner anymore, a canvas, and still no knife had touched him, but that would change soon. The executioner stepped forward, not masked. Not armored, a man of Ghent, a craftsman, and he carried the blade not like a weapon, but like an instrument. Because in Ghent, justice wasn't swift, it was art, and every stroke had a purpose. Before the first cut, Balthasar closed his eyes. He wouldn't keep them closed for long. The first cut was not the deepest, it was the quietest. The knife slid just beneath the surface, parting the skin of Balthasar's back like parchment soaked in warm oil. He didn't scream, not at first. What came out was smaller than a scream, a gasp. The kind a man makes when the world ceases to be abstract and becomes nothing but nerve, breath, and terror. His knees buckled, but the ropes held. The blade moved again. This wasn't a strike. It was a stroke. The executioner didn't rush. He traced the spine, slow and steady, letting the blood guide his line. It wasn't about death. That would come later. This was about separation, not of life from body, but of identity from flesh. To peel the traitor from the man and leave him with nothing but pain. The crowd remained still. Children buried their faces in cloaks. Some men looked away, but most watched, not with bloodlust, but with something colder. They weren't watching Balthasar suffer. They were watching the city cleanse itself. Every inch of skin removed was an inch of betrayal undone. The executioner worked with precision, first the back, then the flanks. The skin curled away in strips, wet and curling like parchment left too long in fire. Blood ran thick down Balthasar's legs. His body writhed, no longer under his command, torn between fleeing and fainting. But he could do neither. The ropes were too tight, the pain too sharp, and then he screamed. It wasn't a noble sound, not the cry of a man enduring torment with dignity. It was broken, ragged, animal, like something not meant for the human mouth. He screamed until his voice cracked, then gasped in silence, and then screamed again because the flaying hadn't stopped. It had only just begun. They turned him. The crowd shifted slightly, as if collectively inhaling. Now they could see his face and what was left of it. Eyes wide, teeth clenched, lips dry and cracked from thirst and panic. He tried to speak again, but only blood came. No one approached. No one offered water. This wasn't punishment. This was reclamation. His chest, once proud and broad, now trembled as the blade moved across it. The flesh split easier here, softer, warmer. His body convulsed, and for a moment he vomited blood onto the stones beneath him. The executioner paused only to wipe the knife clean before continuing. He wasn't done. He was never meant to be done, not yet. Above the square, church bells began to toll, not for the dead, for the hour. But to Balthasar, they sounded like a funeral, his own, and still they hadn't killed him, because this wasn't about death. This was about exposure, to lay bare every lie he ever told, every deal made in shadow. Every moment he smiled while the city bled. And until that truth was carved into open air, Ghent would not let him die. But soon, his body would begin to fail. No man survives this forever, not even a traitor. And when his breath faltered and his vision blurred, the final act would begin, not in private, not in haste, but in front of the gates he once betrayed. They didn't bury him, they displayed him. When the skin finally stopped peeling, when Balthasar's body could no longer convulse, when his screams had dissolved into wet gasps and his blood formed thick pools beneath his feet, they didn't grant him death. They granted him silence, and then they unbound what was left of him. He didn't fall, he collapsed, not like a man giving in, but like a structure whose foundation had been sawed away. He hit the stone not with a crash, but with a thud, heavy, final. The executioner didn't speak. The crowd didn't move. The square had become a cathedral of judgment, and its sermon was done, but Ghent wasn't finished. What they wanted wasn't just justice. They wanted memory, a warning stitched from skin. They took what remained of Balthasar's hide, bloodied, ragged, stretched in uneven sheets, and carried it not to a grave, but to the gates. The very gates he had opened for the Duke, the gates that had let betrayal walk in dressed as diplomacy. And there they hung it, not folded, not draped, pinned, spread, displayed, like a banner, like a flag. But this flag didn't represent a kingdom. It didn't carry a lion or fleur-de-lis. It carried pores, scars, human texture. It carried the last breath of a man who had chosen another master over his own people and paid for that loyalty with every inch of his flesh. The wind caught it, and it moved, not like cloth, but like something still alive. The people who passed beneath it would feel their stomachs turn. Some would stop and stare, some would pray, but all would remember, because Ghent hadn't punished a man. It had authored a message. There would be no second betrayal. Balthasar's name was never struck from the records. That was the point. He wasn't erased. He was preserved as a symbol, a warning, a ritual. Teachers would whisper his story to apprentices. Fathers would point up at the gate and lower their voice. That's what happens, they'd say, when you sell out your own. The Duke never marched into Ghent, not after that. His soldiers returned, but they did so slowly, carefully, and with eyes trained upward at the gate, where their gold had failed and their plans had come undone. But even after the flesh rotted, even after the skin was taken down or lost to time, the gate still stood. And so did the story, because in a city like Ghent, vengeance didn't need to be repeated. It only needed to be remembered. And yet, beyond the stone and the silence, one question lingered like a shadow behind every window. How far would a city go to protect itself from betrayal? Some say too far. But then again, they hadn't seen what came next. The horror wasn't in what they did to him. It was in how easy it was to watch. Long after Balthasar's flesh had been nailed to the gate, after the crowd dispersed and the stone square was washed with cold water and ash, the city went back to its rhythm. Markets reopened, wheels turned, the butcher sharpened his knives. Children played again beneath the same windows where days earlier silence had been the only sound. Ghent moved on, not because it forgot, but because it had absorbed the act, digested it, and made it part of its bones. That's what true horror looks like, not frenzy, not mobs frothing with chaos, but collective calm, a city that knew exactly what it was doing and did it anyway. The post was cleaned, the tools set aside. The executioner returned to his workshop, his hands steady. No medals, no thanks, he didn't need them. In Ghent, justice wasn't about reward, it was about balance, and Balthasar had tilted the scale too far. Some say the city mourned, but if it did, it mourned quietly. Others whispered of strange things, that dogs wouldn't pass beneath the gate where the skin had been hung, that the wind always changed direction near it, that the stone beneath the post grew darker over time, no matter how often it was scrubbed. And then there were the dreams. A handful of men who had stood closest during the flaying, merchants, guild leaders, even a young scribe, claimed to wake in the middle of the night gasping for breath, their backs burning, their flesh crawling, as if invisible blades had found them in sleep. None of them ever spoke of it openly, but one by one they moved away from the city, quietly, without explanation, because justice, when served with the blade, never disappears. It sinks into the walls, into the breath of the people, into the rhythm of footsteps echoing through cold stone corridors. Ghent never flayed another man like that again, but it didn't need to. One was enough. One is always enough. And when travelers passed through the old city gates years later, when they looked up and saw the bare stone where something once hung, something human, they didn't ask questions. They simply walked faster. Because somewhere deep in the marrow of the city, behind every closed door and every quiet glance, Balthasar was still screaming. Ghent never forgot, and neither should we. Balthasar's body was destroyed, but his story remained, etched into stone, into skin, into the silence of a city that knew exactly what it had done. This wasn't a royal execution. This was something darker, a punishment not from above, but from below, from neighbors, from the very people he thought he served. But what happened in Ghent wasn't unique. History is littered with the screams of those who lost power and the flesh that came with it. If you think Balthasar's death was brutal, wait until you see what they did to a queen accused of betrayal. Anne Boleyn once wore a crown, and days later, her neck was laid bare on the scaffold. Watch the brutal fall of Anne Boleyn. And if that wasn't enough, witness the savage dismemberment of a man who defied a king and paid the ultimate price. William Wallace wasn't just executed, he was ripped to pieces. Watch William Wallace, executed, emasculated, and ripped to pieces. Subscribe to Tortures of the Crown to follow more stories where power turns to agony, loyalty breaks in blood, and the crown always takes more than it gives. And if you're ready for what comes next, choose your next execution.